thank you for attending tonight's presentation of Episode 3 of Vietnam. We were graciously hosted by the Hingham Public Library. It is Tuesday, November 21st. Abby McLean, who's in the audience now, was sort of the orchestrator of this event tonight, and which will be followed by a panel discussion. I also like to thank the director, Linda Harper, who I see is in the audience as well. Hopefully we have some members of who were of that generation in the audience who viewed this episode 3, and we'll be able to discuss some things with our panel. To my immediate left here is Robert Beale Jr., United States Air Force. Next is Joe Mastriani, U.S. Army. Joe is also a teacher at the Hingham High School, and Bob is a longtime Hingham resident. Next door to Joe is Tom Burbank, who also served in the U.S. Army, Hingham resident. And the last person on the end is John Asher, United States Navy, also a Hingham resident. At this time, I'm just going to pass the mic off to these guys so they can briefly talk about their experience in the war, and then we'll circle back for some discussion questions. So, Bob, if you could start it off.
Good evening. Before I talk anything about myself, this episode 3 was 1964 and 1965. I need to read you some names. Pay attention to the dates. Panel 19E, line 48, 5/6/1967, United States Army. Curtis E. Chase, born November 11th, 1943. Panel 26E, line 14, 9/6/1967, United States Marine Corps. George Alfred Nash, Jr., date of birth, January 19th, 1948. Panel 37E, line 14, February 3rd, 1968, United States Army. Barry Lee Wolk, January 22nd, 1944. Panel 29W, line 11, March 8th, 1969, United States Air Force. William B. Terry, date of birth, July 24th, 1929. Panel 50W, line 15, 7/26, 1969, United States Army. Charles Thomas McNutt, date of birth, November 10th, 1949. Panel 19W, line 29, March 8th, 1969, United States Marine Corps. My classmate, James Ronald Byrne, Hose, November 5th, 1948. Panel 2W, line 56, 10/30, 1971, United States Air Force. Robert E. Ryan, Jr., date of birth, August 5th, 1947. After adding Bobby G. Barbie, 25W, line 29, Hans J.R. Lorenz, panel 6E, line 11. George B. Gruens, Jr., panel 14E, line 63. And Robert P. Rumpley, panel 14E, line 95. That was as of 29th May 2006, 58,253 names on the wall. Born and raised in Hingham, class of 1967. This year was our 50th high school reunion. Jimmy Burns was who we thought about, Hose. When Jimmy wasn't in trouble, Jimmy sat in the relay box in West Hingham. He was a great kid, homeroom, funny kid, laughed a lot. Vietnam, a very short time. I went to the United States Army recruiter, and I failed the physical. I was draft exempt, very bewildered. Next door neighbor was an Air Force recruiter, said, Bob, the Air Force will fix will remediate your medical defect. Come with me. I did. So part of my 4-year commitment with the Air Force was to be fixed medically. They did a good job. I went to a 40-week electronic school, volunteered to go to Vietnam. I spent an overlap between 1970 and 1971 in Vietnam as a Doppler radar technician for EC-47s and F-4s in a little place called Phu Cat. You heard about tonight Quang Nhân and Pleiku. We were right between them. Binh Dinh province where Ho Chi Minh was born. The only time I had fired an M16 before I went to Vietnam was in basic training. I had never lifted a weapon or touched a weapon from that point. I was not combat trained. I went to Vietnam scared to shit every single day because I had no way of defending myself. My job was a tool bag to fix aircraft and make sure that the bombs get dropped where they need to be dropped. And then my brothers came home.
Excuse me, Joe Mastriani. I'm a member of the West Point class of 1964. 24 of my classmates died in this war. As a 23-year-old, I was the artillery forward observer for B Company of the 502nd Infantry. I spent 10 months walking the woods, the rice paddies, and the jungles of Vietnam. 10 months. This particular episode captured the lot of the individual GI very, very, very well. Excellent portrayal of what it was like. I got through the first year in 1968. Anybody old enough remembers the Tet Offensive. I was commanding officer of a 105 millimeter howitzer battery. We got alerted to go with the 82nd Airborne Division to Vietnam. Again, I deployed with a vastly understrength unit that was filled out in 2 days with literally dozens of young men who I didn't even know. I was there for 5 or 6 months, returned in the summer of '68, subsequently left the Army in the beginning of 1970.
Thank you. My name is Tom Burbank, and I was in the United States Army from 1955 to 1958. And you're probably wondering why I'm sitting up here, because this episode was in 1965. Well, I'm here to give you a little bit of information. We were in Vietnam a long time before. 1962 was when the official time. And although my experience wasn't as difficult as the two men to my right, and I thank them for what they did, it was an experience that I'll never forget. One that was inconclusive, one that was a very short duration, but one that will be with me for the rest of my life. Thank you.
My name is John Asher. I was an officer in the U.S. Naval Security Group from 1969 to 1972. Was stationed originally at a secret base in Japan, where we conducted signals intelligence and electronic intelligence communication security activity. And my second set of orders took me to the National Security Agency, where I spent about 2 years.
So, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Keith German. I'm a Senior Chief Petty Officer in the U.S. Navy Seabees. I'm a combat veteran of both Operation Desert Storms and Iraqi Freedom, and now the global war on terrorism. We are here tonight again to view that film in its excellence. That was only segment 3 of, I believe, 18 parts. Well put together with PBS's help and is being shown. And I highly encourage anyone to try to take it all in. I know it's a lot, but it's an important part of our American history. At this time, I'd like to ask if there's anyone in the audience that has a question, and I will simply come to you and hold the mic. The mic is not amplified, but it is allow people at home to hear it on HCAM.
Thank you guys so much for coming, and thank you for your service. I was just curious to see which one of you was the one that was in the film briefly. Was that was you? So was that at the part where the soldiers were singing? It was okay.
The 101st Airborne. No, the part was where the ship carrying the 101st Airborne was landing. I actually have the CBS version of that where you can see me easily. You'd have to know exactly where I was standing to see it on this clip.
Was it clear when you were there? Was the media presence? Were you how aware were you of the media presence? Because it seems like there was so much, or at least more, in this war than had ever been before.
Honestly, the viewpoints that any one of us would have would be dependent upon the year we were there and where we were in branch of service. And there's a lot of journalists were around, but they were looking to bring forth a lot of news and promote themselves too. The journalists that were in Vietnam were in their young 20s. They needed to get a war to cut their notches and within their media. So they went out and did a lot. They had a lot to do with bringing the influences that changed the spirit of the country toward the war, unfortunately, toward the soldier. That was the most difficult part. I think I failed to mention that the 7 names I read are Hingham residents that were killed in Vietnam. One of the planes that I worked on was an EC-47. It was electronic countermeasure. EC-47 to DC-3. The planes were 50 years old. I was 21. And it fed to the systems that John worked on. It fed to the Bravo systems, the crypto systems. These planes flew out over the Ho Chi Minh Trail with it's a top secret mission at the time. We knew very little except to piece what we did. And we fed ground speed and drift to a system called Bravo system, and the operators, the crypto operators, we never saw unless they were on the airplane. I don't even know where those guys lived. They were only in country for 89 days, and they went back to Okinawa. Because if you were in country for 89 days, your body was not counted as being in Vietnam. You had to be in Vietnam 90 days to be counted on the registers. But these information that was picked up from these jungle penetrators, they had dropped these transducers along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and that's where they gathered the intelligence information to determine troop movements for the B-52 Arclight missions. So before going to Vietnam, I was with the 99th Bomb Wing out of Westover Air Force Base, and we rotated on quarters to Southeast Asia to perform those B-52 missions.
I was only tangentially aware of journalists, although I owe one who is anonymous a great debt of gratitude. We were in a heap of trouble. He took a picture of me. That picture brings back so many memories of what it was like. This very early in the war, September of '65, we were clearing the An Khe Pass. You saw in the episode the 1st Cavalry Division landing at An Khe. What they didn't tell you was the 101st Airborne cleared the road through the pass and the area of An Khe so we could get in there. But that was my only knowledge of journalists.
We saw no journalists at all. We never even got to Saigon. And we were only there 89 days. And the government doesn't acknowledge the fact that there were the people there. I jumped from a C-47 when I took my paratroop training, so I realized how old they were at the time I was there. So I can't shed any light upon what the press had to say about that. I'm sure they'd had plenty if they knew we were there.
I can say with total confidence that there was no journalist. We couldn't even go under anesthesia without having somebody else present to make sure that something was said that shouldn't have been. So, no journalists.
Is there any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
One of the issues that seemed to come up in the course of this whole series was discussion, was the war winnable or not winnable? And I'm wondering if you gentlemen, when you were there or before or after, had any sense that it was or it wasn't?
Obviously, like each of us, I mean, we saw little pieces in '69 and '70 when I was in Westpec. There was a tremendous force. I mean, it's hard to ascertain what was really happening on the ground. I guess my gut was that, as the episode said, that we weren't going to prevail by strictly working to take territory and then to give it back. And so the implication that we were not going to occupy Vietnam permanently, to me, was sort of a built-in factor that had me thinking we were fighting a war that was ultimately not going to be winnable.
I don't think I had any idea at the time I was there as a 21-year-old young man what the outcome was going to be. Except on the way back, I was told that we would probably be involved eventually, and it's one of the reasons we went there, is to familiarize myself. That was brought home very true to me in 1962 in July, 2 weeks before my full discharge from the Army came, when I got visited by someone who called himself a traveling explosives expert, who asked me if I'd like to come back in the Army as a result of the training I'd had. At that time, Mrs. Burbank, we all had one child, and she was pregnant, and I very thankfully told him no, because my mind had changed very definitely by that time.
As a ground troop, I really did not understand at the time. I was just doing my duty. Many years later, doing a lot of reading about it and becoming familiar with the history, I would say absolutely unwinnable, or just temporarily winnable, that would have been lost in the long term. This was a nationalist effort. This was not a, well, it was a war of insurrection against foreigners, any kind of foreigners, Chinese, French, American. That war was unwinnable.
I was over there later than the gentleman to my left. So a lot had transpired here in this country and also in Vietnam. And one of the things that struck me when I got to Vietnam was the men my age walking around the streets in civilian clothes that were not in the military. It baffled me because there were brothers of mine at home who were going to jail, leaving the country, in protest of the war. And we took such a strong stance here to do that and create the animosity toward the individuals. But here I step off an airplane.
Good evening. The library will be closing.
And the first thing that I see is the rats in the trash cans and the overwhelming, stifling heat.
You are using a library
And then
now in
get woken up my first morning in my transit quarters by a mama-san holding up a jar, a Skippy peanut butter jar full of rice and fish heads, asking me if I want breakfast. going to processing into my base because I was supposed to be stationed in Tan Son Nhut, which was Saigon. And within 12 hours of arriving in country, I was transferred to a place called Phuket. When I asked where it was, all I was told was, I don't want to be there. When I tried to get an airplane to go there, now I'm in the Air Force going to an Air Force base to work on aircraft, and I cannot get an airplane to the base. I have to fly to an Army base, to Quang Nhân, and take a blue Air Force school bus with rat wire in the window so they can't lob grenades in, and a bus ride through the countryside. And the briefing that I get, again, I was not combat trained. I did not carry a weapon. The bus driver said, if we get attacked, I have an M16, you're on your own. It was a bizarre place. It was not winnable. I saw things where I was. The spirit of what I saw with the Vietnamese did not, their heart and soul was not into it, I don't believe. Those are my observations. And it's just difficult to see that stuff that went on. In other episodes of this series, they talk about how the North Vietnamese sent their children off to Russia so they wouldn't have to fight the war. It's very, very frustrating.
Is there any other questions? Is there anyone in the audience who is actually a member of any armed forces who was in Vietnam at the time? Sir, would you like to identify yourself?
Bill Murphy from Weymouth. I was there at the end. I was there, there was only 33 days left. I was there at the ceasefire. And the gentleman mentioned how there were civilians in Saigon, not in military clothing. I think there was a Vietnamese congressman, in their assembly, who said, why should we send Vietnamese boys to die what Americans are doing? On Weymouth, by the way, there's a couple of interesting historical points on Weymouth. In your time, I think there was the actual first American casualty was a kid from Weymouth. He was from Squantum. He was at the Weymouth Naval Air Base. He went over there, and I thought it was interesting how he died. Do you know how he died? He was handing out candy, and he was shot by a fellow American serviceman, which is kind of a statement in and of itself. And then there's only 2 father-son casualties in Vietnam, and one of the pairs was from Weymouth, a father and a son. So again, thanks for your service, guys.
Sure, welcome home. Thank you. Is there anyone else that served during that conflict?
Could I ask just one more question? If you guys could briefly say, what was your analysis or your perception of the Vietnamese over there, whether military or civilian, and if you felt you knew them, you knew their culture, because that was a theme in the series.
The Vietnamese that I was involved with were Mama Sans and Papa Sans. We had Mama Sans that cleaned the hooches. The hooches were our barracks. 2-story wood frame buildings. We had each had a little 2-bed cubicle, and they would clean the room, wash your clothes, shine your boots. It cost you $2 a month per man. They worked in the chow halls. They did menial tasks on the base. One of the things that surprised me is the day I saw a Deuce and a Half come in loaded with bombs, and it was a Vietnamese driver. I thought that was kind of different. But I remember distinctly one afternoon when every Vietnamese worker we had on base all got sick. All started bending over. Number 10, number 10, I number 10. Sick, I gotta go. And watching an elderly Vietnamese woman running to beat the band to get out of that base. And it was, no one had to tell us anything. We didn't have to wait for a siren. We just went and got your helmet, got your flak jacket, and crawled into a hole. Within a half hour of the last person that left that base, we got rocket attacked. And then they all came back the next day, and they thought it was funny. They thought it was a joke. The base I was at had 3 sides free fire zone, where if you saw anything moving, it didn't matter. You fired at it. You could shoot 24 hours a day. One side was the village of Phuket. That's where I was. I'm sure other people in the jungles or other places have different things, but it was different.
I had virtually no contact with Vietnamese. One that I'll always remember, I was assigned to go on an operation with a regional force company, and I'm pretty adept in French, and the company commander could speak French, and we were doing fine until we hit some area where he abruptly took a turn, and I went from the back of the company forward to stop him and say, "Where are you going?" All of a sudden, he couldn't speak French anymore. But he knew where the enemy was. He wasn't going there.
The people we worked with, to echo the comments of one of the people in this segment, is they knew what they were doing. And essentially, we learned from them. We offered some insight to them and so on and so forth, but we learned from them through an interpreter.
As with the press, I didn't have any experience with the Vietnamese.
Before we wrap it up, is there one final question that anyone would like to ask? If not, I'd like to invite Abby up to maybe close us out. And if Linda, if you have anything you'd like to say, please come forward.
Sure. Thank you so much, Keith, and thank you guys so very much for your time and again your service, and thank you guys all for coming. We don't have any more plans for the rest of the grant. We had our speaker earlier in the month, and he was excellent, and we'll have the DVD and also the companion book, which is a really good book as well, circulating and everything else, so we hope you pick it up.